thoughts about the topic that we're addressing, and that is actually dear to heart. So just take it away.
And Joseph gave us the perfect transition, because one of your last sentences was that wetlands can sequester carbon. And that shifts into, let's talk about carbon. So you're going to hear a bit about that and how it's impacting all of our lives.
Well, what a treat it is to be with you. What a remarkable panel of also real hackers. I mean, your hacker community, your young hacker community must be just buzzing with excitement, because here are stories about people who are out there who are hacking basically the future. And in a way, that's what Lisa and I are going to talk about as well, is that, we kind of gave it the title that says creating the regenerative era. We're actually in a transition of a human era. We're creating a new civilization. I think that, again, what we just heard kind of points in that direction. It points in the direction. This is the moment for us humans to come together and to create an entirely new way of being for us as a humanity, because what we have created in the previous civilization, previous era, is no longer capable to support life on this planet. And we're presumably smart enough now that we can discover what we've done to start to do the kind of things that we just heard, and to hack our way into a livable future. So what we want to do is just build on that. We're going to take you on a journey, and as Urska just said, we're sometimes being seen as visionaries, looking deep into things, but we're also going to look deep into the history of how we got to this point, and how to frame all this remarkable work that now needs to be done in a way that hopefully motivates yet another level of energy, motivates another level of activation action. So with that, so you want to frame it a bit?
Yeah, so welcome home. We do a lot of work with innovation, but it's important to go, we're not just innovating out in space, we're innovating on this living, breathing Earth that we have. And so as Herman just said, we're going to talk about first, where do we come from? A deep look back, so we understand, how did we get to this moment? Where are we now? And where are we going? So we'll have three different parts. Just a little bit to say what we do is that we tend to work with leaders and innovators and companies, and we work with them around three main things. And the first one is, what's their business strategy? But we're based in Silicon Valley, so we're in a culture that's always looking ahead. So it's always the strategy that to do that, you first look outside and see, where's the world going? What's happening? What are the trends? What are the disruptions? What are the real opportunities? Those are things you're looking at now. But so to do that, and then come back to, what's your strategy? So where's the world going? And who do you want to be in this new emerging world? And the who is what you're creating, but it is also bringing your own values into it, about what's your brand? What do you stand for? What's your point of view? What makes it uniquely you, as well as what you're creating? And then out of that, we look at, and who does it take to create this? Where's the world going, what you want to create in that new world, but who are you creating it with? Whether it's a team of 3 people or 300 people or a community of thousands of people, how does that group learn to innovate together and create this? So we look at innovation best practices and this future-driven leadership. So those are the kinds of things we facilitate groups and work with. We tend to work with companies all over the world. We're based in Silicon Valley, but we work with them from everywhere. We do a lot of writing about what we do. We come out of Silicon Valley, so we have that spirit, but certainly all the groups we work with are everywhere, because there's innovators everywhere. So I wanted to put this picture up to show, when Herman talked before about the shift in eras, what we mean about that. And so if you'd even say agricultural era and moving into industrial and moving into the digital, where everything became social and mobile and global, but also what's this new hyper digital era? What is it? And that's what people have come to us most about in the last number of years, which is everything's getting smart and connected. We can put sensors on everything. We have data for everything. The data tells us not just what's happening, but predictive analytics, what's going to happen next. And sometimes with AI and machine learning, then it's actually just autonomous. You might need just a little bit of human intervention to say, it goes directly from data to prediction to take the next action. Robotics is part of that. Autonomous, anything that moves is getting built in to move autonomously, and we can talk to all of it in natural language. So we've been in this amazing new era of new technologies, creating whole new capabilities, just as when industrialization moved jobs to the city and digitalization, we know what that did, where every industry got digitized. But this white line is, we're hitting a wall. We are on such a roll. It's so exciting, all these technologies. And then nature says, hey, remember me? I'm here. You happen to be on this living planet. And so suddenly we have other issues and other kinds of crises coming in.
So this is interesting. So that wall is represented nearly every day with new information, right? So these are just from the last few weeks. This is all January kind of information, where the one on the left is about a really sort of, that one really took my breath away in terms of the study that basically says that as the temperature rises, the capacity for living organisms, for plants to absorb CO2 is presumed to go down by at least a third. So as it gets warmer, plants are less capable of absorbing CO2 and actually start putting CO2 into the atmosphere. That's a stunning piece of information, just came out a few weeks ago. Southern Ocean waters are warming faster than thought. Then this interesting one, we'll talk a little bit more about that. The World Economic Forum talking about climate change will be sudden and cataclysmic. We need to act fast. So we're seeing a movement in a direction where leaders in the world, business leaders, political leaders are making that switch. Again, we're going to talk further about that a little bit later.
And every time we talk about these things, we tend to look and see what are the newest articles that just came out. So we're looking, and the scary thing is they're always there and they're always getting worse. So even for us personally, it's terrifying to talk about these things because of the kinds of things we have to look at and not look away.
So now we're going to take a little bit of a journey. In order to look deeply into the future, into this moment, we're going to start looking back deeply. So Lisa,
very
take
deeply.
that away.
Yeah. So we're going to just give you a couple of slides from something that's a science exhibit called A Walk Through Time. And it's going to be soon in Switzerland. I think starting next month, it'll be there. It's been in Austria. It travels around the world. It started in the US. So it started at HP with Hewlett-Packard. Sid Liebes was a scientist who was part of creating it. And what it is a walk through the history of life on Earth. So we look back these like 4.7 billion years of life on Earth. And every step that you walk basically is a little bit, step and a half, is a million years. And so you walk through time, but you viscerally really feel what was happening at what times and how did we get to where we are. And we picked just a few of these. We picked just a few of these panels in it that we think relate to our current moment.
So if you were to walk this walk, it would be a kilometer and a half, if each foot is a million years.
So we wanted to say, when is it that we know Earth's first life forms that we have knowledge of? And those were 4 billion years ago, where the bacteria was taking the available elements and making biological molecules. And what I want to say about that one is that your DNA that's in you, these are your ancestors, right? The DNA that you have, that's where your DNA was then, right? That's where we all started. So if somebody says, how old are you? And you want to give what age you think you were born on Earth, well, some part of you is 4 billion years old.
4,000 million years.
4,000 million years old. So that DNA that was first formed on Earth, from that very first DNA, went like parent, child, parent, child, parent, child, right? All the way to you. And if it had ever died, you wouldn't be here. And so we didn't live through everything, right? There were lots of different species and things that were not us, but we're connected to these very first ones.
So 300 million years into life's existence, there were evolutionary processes that allowed these early microorganisms to ferment CO2 into food, into making their own bodies, and it was sort of the beginning of the creation of oxygen, right? And that's a really important point when you look at what we could be, right? We have a few examples around us that may have started very much like us, and this is where they are now. And
those fermenters are still around. So we'll come back to them later in the story too. Goldilocks and 3 atmospheres, you know, ours is just right for us. But it didn't start out that way. So life created our atmosphere. So that what's keeping us alive, that we're living and breathing, but all the other planets in the solar system were 98% carbon dioxide. And it was life took in the CO2 and gave off oxygen. And so and then it's been quite steady and kept it for millions of years. But what's happened, this is then 2 billion years, halfway into life, to where we are now, right? Halfway in, life was still single-celled organisms that were taking in the CO2 and giving off oxygen. But oxygen was pollution for them. It was waste. It was toxic to them. It dissolved their bodies. So at that point, they were just throwing their waste into the air and they were drowning in it. They were dying.
Sounds kind of familiar.
Yeah, they were being poisoned by their own waste that they threw into the air. And so what happened is, because we're here, they didn't all die, but 90% of life died. It was the first major extinction on our planet where 90% of life died, and it could have just been the end of this experiment of life on Earth.
We could be Mars.
Yeah, we could be Mars. So 10% of life survived. And some of those hid so that they're still in swamps and some of those marshlands and wetlands that we heard about today. They're inside us, somewhat inside other cells. So we actually have more DNA in us from those early microbes than we have of our own personal DNA that we think of as our identity. There's more of them than of us in our body, and they do all kinds of things for us. But also a very small percent learned to breathe oxygen. And so they did something that had never existed. These single-celled organisms invented a major process that had never existed on the planet before. And what it did is it gave them a boost in energy. They actually got much more energy from oxygen than they did from the earlier molecules. So that enabled them, for the first time, life could move. Before that, these organisms drifted along the water and kind of wherever the water went, they went. But they now had more energy. They could swim upstream. They could do things. So between getting multicellular organisms that could go somewhere, and then you need a brain to figure out where you're going to go, or some kind of mechanism. So that's just shows you that here, these early, you know, our earliest ancestors, halfway through Earth, were almost getting killed off, and they innovated their way out of trouble.
So another 1.5 billion years later, so 15,000 million years later, we begin to see the possibility of these organisms to mineralize tissues and start looking more familiar to us, right? Bones and shells and things of that nature. We're still in the oceans, basically.
And there's things we're learning about that, about how to make carbonates that also may be some of our solutions now to our carbon issues. So up until 400 million years ago, so like about 3/4 of the way of life, we were all in the ocean, right? Life was only in the ocean. And then imagining, we think it's just like, think about what that must have been like when life could finally come out of the water and come onto land and had this whole empty territory to innovate into. And so how momentous that was.
There's a period of time where the Earth was covered with large forests that got folded under as continental shifts started happening, and that became our oil and gas, right? That took about 70 million years. So the reason why we're telling you all these stories is because we're hoping that the hackers, as they think about where are the solutions, they think back to these processes and start to rethink how to use, you know, potentially biological solutions that could, you know, go back to the very origins of life, and this being one of them.
So these forests that grew over about 40 to 50 billion years, right, from land, we came up onto land, all these trees grew, they got buried, they become oil. Well, 40 billion years worth of, 40 million years worth of liquid plants, right, is what we've been taking up in about 50 years, have done a major amount of putting that up into the air.
So then this was a big deal. We're all familiar with that. The big last very large extinction with an asteroid that hit the Yucatan Peninsula was the end of the dinosaurs. And what's so fascinating about the dinosaurs was that they had been around for 165 million years. These were creatures that owned this planet for a much, much longer time than we've been around. And that's just an interesting one to remember. And, you know, the point here also is that after an extinction event like that, it takes tens of millions of years to basically recover the same level of biodiversity. What's interesting is that the survivors of this mass extinction were also among the survivors were small mammals, nocturnal mammals that didn't care about there not being sunlight. And those are basically our mammalian ancestors. In the last 5 million years, it sort of moved in a direction where it's really becoming more recognizable from today's perspective. Humanoids of our type have been around for about 300,000 years or thereabout. So, had we taken this walk, as we described, where every foot is 1 million years, we would now end up sort of at the top of our toenail, having just walked 1.5 kilometers to manifest the duration of human presence on this planet. So just to take that in, the idea again was we wanted to start with that because as we look into the future, it's good to remember how we came to this moment. And that to realize that life is fundamental to creating a living organism, this living earth, and that transformed something that was not capable of holding life into something that was workable. And that after each extinction, it takes tens of millions of years to return to the previous level of biodiversity. If we don't do the kind of things that you marvelous hackers just talked about, and basically orient ourselves to interacting actively, proactively with our planet at a level where we repair it, where we take it back, Mother Earth is going to take her 10 million years and she doesn't care, right? She's perfectly happy to see what comes next. That's what we're up against. We have to basically, in the next 10 or so years, create the foundation to taking care of a $10 million year process that otherwise we're going to be counting on, or life is going to count on.
So we're the only species that knows this story. We're assuming that there's not other species that know it. They're not going to be able to do things about it. It's us. And that we're the first generation in our species to know. So when my parents were born, it was amazing that there was like this solar system and it was inside a galaxy. And as far as they knew, there was one galaxy at that point, right about the time they were born. So no other no other generation had all the knowledge to know what was happening and know their moment in time.
And this is really encouraging, hopefully, to your hackers, right? This is why we need to hack our way into this. We are the species to know. And so we're going to take a look now a bit at where are we now. We're going to rely in part on the Climate Reality Project for the information that we're going to share here.
And the Climate Reality Project is Al Gore's project, and it's a training, and he has now the last training, they're doing it online. People used to fly to places, and they had small groups. He did an online training, and the software could hold 10,000 people. But 14,000 signed up, so they actually did 2 of them. They're doing another training starting on Earth Day on April 22nd. It's usually about 9 days, and you spend a couple of hours per day.
Definitely.
There's homework assignments about what it means to you, what you're learning. And when you're finished with that, you have access to all of Al Gore's slides. So it's climatereality.org. So if anyone's really interested in that, it's an amazing training, amazing resource. The training itself is free.
So just a quick background, we all know that, but just to remind ourselves again, is that, the sun shines, it's happening right now here, and most of the radiation is absorbed and warms the earth. But then there's this wonderful, layer of, that protects our earth, and some of that radiation gets put back out into space.
But some of it hits that kind of the glass ceiling away of the greenhouse and comes back onto Earth, and that heat from the sun stays inside. And then that blue line is thickening, so that as CO2 increases, more of that radiation is getting trapped. So one of the things we'll look at is that is already there, right? We already have the glass on the greenhouse. So we've got heat already inside. So even if we took everything we did now and we became all renewable technologies, that heat is still there, and more of it's coming every day. So as long as we're living inside a greenhouse, we're still going to be getting more natural heat and radiation from the sun every single day.
But in addition to that natural heat, we're also putting in all this man-made global warming pollution, 152 million tons every 24 hours. And that's the equivalent, just the heat energy is equivalent to 500,000 Hiroshima bombs, or more than 5 of those Hiroshima bombs every second, right? These are extraordinary levels of energy that we're putting into this very of life. And we also, of course, know where it comes from, right? Pretty much everything we do, everything we produce is based on pulling out that 70 million years worth of, carbon and putting it into our atmosphere.
So our industry, our agriculture, any transportation, our waste. So everything, we just have run a whole carbon-based economy. That's what our whole world is. And the reason we showed those era curves, the life cycle curves, is even as humans, we have changed the whole nature of what a whole ecosystem and industrial system ran on when we went from agriculture to being major industrialized. And then it's also starting with our digital world. So we've been through these transformations, but right now, that's why we called it an era and not just a few innovation tools that we need. It's like, how do you get a system this enormous to change?
So, all these different things, from electricity production to transportation to buildings, they're putting all this extra CO2 into the atmosphere, and nature can absorb about 40% of that, and the other 60% are remaining in the atmosphere. Again, this is our challenge, right? This is where Mother Nature is going to take her 10 million years to fix that unless we do, right? So, this is another important sort of framing of our challenge, which is that for as long as humanity has been around, as long as life has been on this planet for the last 3 million years or so, the atmosphere has fluctuated between about 170 and 300 parts per million. And when I was born at that time, we broke that ceiling and went past these 300 parts per million to 417 by now, 417 parts per minute per million. And that's a world that later on we'll talk just quickly about. We actually can understand. We know what the Earth looked like back then. The problem is that, as Lisa just pointed out as well, is that we now have this legacy load of about 1,000 gigatons of CO2, and CO2 is a persistent molecule. It stays there for thousands of years unless we find ways to do it. So even if we drive Teslas, and not that is in itself a sustainable vehicle, but you get the point. Even if we go to sort of this idea of net zero, or let's stop putting stuff out, we're going to be in an interesting challenge. And again, hackers, hear that? We're going to have to think about that. We're going to have to think about how to bring it back down.
Right, we put the carbon up there.
Right.
So that last picture too, that had that line that pretty much goes just straight up, is the concept that no human's been alive when, and you can pretty much say that every year now, that no human has ever lived at a time where carbon was this high. We're figuring out what that actually means.
So the result, of course, is that, those of us who live in the Bay Area, we have had this experience on September 9th. That's the actual way it looked.
It got redder throughout the day.
And it got darker as it went on. This was the source of this light, right? You've heard all about it.
In fact, we were surrounded on most sides by fire then, but the whole West Coast, just a couple of days later, of North America was burning. So from Mexico all the way through the US and all the way up into Canada was all on fire.
Now back to this heat, right? 93% of the heat are trapped are basically absorbed by the ocean. So we want to just make the link. We live on land, we see this heating, but the fact is that the oceans, without the oceans, we'd be toast already, right? The oceans are very benevolent to us. They are giving us a break, but they're not doing it for free, right? It is injuring them in significant ways. So not only do they absorb 93% of the heat, they also absorb a third of the CO2. You all know that, of course. But the real problem is that as that CO2 gets absorbed, much of it turns into carbonic acid, which means the oceans are acidifying at a rate where, if things keep going the way then they're going to be 170% more acidic by the end of the century than they are today, right? That's no living creature can live in that kind of soup, right? It's not possible, and that's in 80 years from now. So this is urgent, right? This is why we're so happy about these hackathons, about the kind of hacks that you guys are doing, that of the team that we just heard. This is what's going to make the possibility happen. That's something that we can get past this reality. This is real if we keep going the way we are.
So, and I think it's maybe one of our most important slides is that by the end of the century, it's too acidic for 97% of ocean life. So we just want to stop for that for a second and take a breath and just say, okay, we're seeing this slide presentation. There's so much information you're getting presented, but sometimes you need to go, we don't just go on to the next slide after that. If the trajectory we're on is killing 97% of life in the ocean by the end of this century, that's just not one more slide. So we wanted to stop and take a breath for that one.
And speaking of oceans and speaking of the trouble that we're heading into, the headwinds we're heading into, is that, you know, the oxygen we breathe, about every second breath we take comes from the ocean, right? It's oxygen that is being produced by phytoplankton, and phytoplankton is suffering as well, right? So while it is such a dominant creator of oxygen, we're again, our heating of the oceans, our acidification of the oceans are putting phytoplankton into the kind of stress where it will no longer be capable of actually producing the oxygen that we're breathing, that all of nature is required, you know, is dependent on.
So
again,
it's another
right,
reason to take a breath, because that's where our breath comes from. Our breath comes from the ocean. So if we're killing off life in the ocean, we're also killing off our own breath as well.
So back to this idea of that the fact that we're over 400 parts per million and what the Earth looked like back then is that we can actually see that. We can go back and the Earth looked like this. So wait, where's Florida? There was no Florida 3 million years ago when it was last time that the atmosphere was at 300 parts per million, at 400 parts per million. So we can project that, right? And so
Manhattan, New York City would be in trouble.
gone,
Lots
right?
of your cities.
And the point is, you know, so it was 3 to 4 degrees warmer than today. The northern hemisphere was ice-free. The sea levels were 60 feet or 18 meters higher than they are today. 18 meters higher. Seas were 80 miles or 130 kilometers further inland. And that the point is that, in a way, we're lagging right now. We're actually not yet living in a world of 400 parts per million. It's just 400 parts per million, but our world is catching up to that. It's kind of like if a scientist said, it's kind of like when you put a frozen lasagna into an oven, right? It's still frozen at the beginning, but if the oven doesn't get cooler, it'll ultimately melt. And so that's the problem we're facing now, is that the reality is that we have not yet reached that 400 parts per million reality. And if we don't do anything and we just say that, we know what it looks like. And that's what it looks like, that you know, it's
going to be a very baked lasagna.
So as Greg said earlier, when he talked, this is actually the same quote basically by Carter Bays, which says, stop thinking about this summer as the warmest in the last 125 years, but the coolest one in the next 125 years. So let's take that in, right? Let's take in that realization. As humans, we always think the crisis of the moment is the crisis, let's get out of it, right? But actually, in this case, the reality is that we're just at the beginning of it, right? And we have to create the consciousness of what are we going to do? How are we going to face this reality together? So we wanted to show you that, you know, while we are living mostly on land with a view to the ocean here, it's this interconnected ecosphere between the ocean, the land, and the atmosphere. And that's what we have to, as you know, the speakers in the previous conversation also pointed out, that's where really the solutions are. That's what we have to hack. We have to hack into this interconnected ecosphere. We put the carbon up there. It's up to us to bring it down. We have to take in what we have done at levels that mobilize action. And in a minute, we're going to talk to you about some very promising things that are actually happening in that direction.
So we're the first generation to know this story. But we're also the last generation to be able to do something about it.
Again, that's a message to you hackers, right? This is why we count on you. You are helping us create a new civilization, a new era that is going to tackle these realities. So we just want to leave you with that segment here to clarify what is the magnitude of the problem we're facing. And so now we want to look at where are we going together, right? How as humans, as engineering thinkers, as creators, we are not going to take this lying down, right? We are going to move into action, and very interesting things are going on. But first, I want to start again with the notion that every day we get some interesting pieces of information. The Arctic is in a death spiral. How much longer will it exist? and the region is unraveling faster than anybody could have once predicted. And then there's always this sort of notion that there may still be time to act, right? There's this sort of throwaway line. I hear it even sometimes from Greta Thunberg, where, we can do something. Well, yes, and we need to start to think deeply about how to get there. This is a thing I showed you before already. It was written for the World Economic Forum by Peter Giger, the group chief risk officer of Zurich Insurance Company. So the insurance companies are starting to sign on and say, we must take immediate action to reduce this and build resilience with these tipping points in mind, because if we don't, climate change will be sudden and cataclysmic, right? So whether it's that guy saying we must act now, right? There's not maybe still time to act. We need to act now, is that we are shifting into, again, what Lisa and I tried to point out, into an entirely new way of humanity, a new era for humanity. So the signals are really interesting, right? Whether it's the head of the UN or the president of China or now Biden, having signed on to the climate agreement, the politicians are starting to tell the story at this level of urgency. The investors, banks, and economic leaders are starting to tell that story at this level of urgency. The head of the Bank of England says companies that don't deal with climate are going bankrupt. Banks are signing on. The World Economic Forum is now talking about it every time. This is the topic at the World Economic Forum.
So this is one that I think is interesting in a unusual kind of way, so it was a Morgan Stanley report that said stopping global warming will cost $50 trillion. So, they're saying it's going to be so much, but
so expensive, right?
Yeah, so expensive. But, we come out of an innovation economy, and as innovators, we think, oh, $50 trillion. Well, if somebody's getting $50 trillion. Who's creating into that space? We have a $50 trillion marketplace. And so in fact, that's what we're seeing, is this regenerative economy. So similar to when the way we did everything in the industrial era became digitized, we're really seeing everything beginning to shift as everybody's starting to look at what would the regenerative economy look like for us, and massive amounts of investment starting to get shifted into doing that. So not just digital, but how can we use any of these tools? Agriculture has a big role to play. Industrial has a big role to play, which you'll see in digital we'll show you some examples in a minute of building that regenerative economy, but we're at the beginning of that yellow line. So for pioneers, it's an amazing time. And that's why it's like the wide open territory of amphibians, like we're coming out of the sea onto land. Look at this big territory ahead of us.
And again, we just wanted to encourage you hackers to see that you are at the source of a new economic model, of a new economic reality, and of a new civilizational sort of reality for humanity.
How big it is. It's not just a little project you're doing, but you're part of something that is urgently needed.
Right. I mean, it's inevitable, actually. Without it, we're toast, right? So this is where we're heading.
And every industry moves across, right? So agriculture is thinking about it, transportation, finance and insurance. You heard that example, manufacturing, healthcare has to deal with the consequences if we don't do it. Energy, just everything. So the way we do everything, everybody's thinking about it.
But there's not much time, right? I mean, the moonshot idea is really powerful because we didn't know how to get to the moon, right? So Kennedy says, by the end of the decade, 10 years, hey, does that sound familiar? We're going to be on the moon. And we did it, right? And so we're going to talk about how we're going to do that. There are really interesting frameworks already popping up that are really useful to start to hack into, to find ways. So Project Drawdown, for those of you who are not familiar with it yet, please make yourself familiar with it, because it defines territories and the impact that those territories will have on our climate to draw down that CO2 out of the atmosphere with all kinds of solutions.
And as you come up with new solutions, they're a group that is a solutions collector, and let them know about what you're coming up with.
And there's a Drawdown lab we'll show you that in a minute. So over 240 global companies have made a commitment to go 100% renewable. Again, from what we just said, you know that that's not enough, right? That's a good start. It's wonderful that they're all signing on to it, but we need to go far beyond renewable, right? We need to become carbon negative. We need to draw that stuff down. Oracle is a recognized leader. This is from 2016 already. They've been at it for quite a long time and are basically a climate A list company that is leading the corporate response to climate change. That's really good to know. So thank you, Oracle.
Yes.
Interestingly, Walmart, this massive company, just a few months ago, Doug McMillon, the president and CEO of Walmart, said, working with our supply chains, customers and NGOs and others, we hope to play a part in transforming the world's supply chains to be more regenerative, right? So that's really important, that a Walmart says, we get it, that we are the ones who have a supply chain that needs to be shifting into this kind of regenerative way. Regenerating means decarbonizing operations and eliminating waste. The world must reduce, avoid, and remove greenhouse gas emissions. No longer is it enough to slow down climate change, protect what we have left. This is the CEO of Walmart. As a society, we are at an inflection point. This is a leader of a company saying, we have a social responsibility, because as a society, we're at an inflection point. If we don't act now, we may not have the opportunity to do something later. These are incredibly important signals, and they come from the companies like Google, right? They've already offset their entire carbon legacy with offsets, and they're committed to carbon-free operations by 2030 and help in the process create new industries and jobs, right? So again, these companies see themselves as facilitators of this new civilizational reality, of this new economic reality, by creating entirely new industries, right? If they move, they kind of pull along the others.
What Google used to do is that they would, for quite a while now, they've been carbon neutral. But what they said is that they did it through offsets. So now this new goal is, which is something they don't know how to do yet, but are determined to find out how, is to be carbon free 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single day of the year, so that they'll never be, it's not like they're putting more carbon up and then paying somebody else to pull it down. They're never going to be putting it up.
Hugely important. But similarly, Microsoft is making really interesting commitments.
So the top leaders in Microsoft, right? The president, the CFO, the CEO, these were statements that they made over the last year, that they made a commitment to be carbon negative by 2030, so that they're going to start pulling carbon down, and to have offset all of their historical legacy carbon emissions by 2050. So it means that if there's any carbon that's in our atmosphere by 2050, it did not come from Microsoft. They're taking down everything they've put up. So imagine that if we think about doing that, any carbon you use today, do you drive somewhere on fossil fuel? What's the energy in the building that you're sitting in now? Just think about if the carbon you're using every single day that you knew you were going to have to pull back out later, might make you much more aware of how much you're using every day.
I think you're making a really important point. I think that companies need to make that kind of commitment. That's really important, right? We own our legacy footprint. We own everything we put out. What are we now going to do to take it back out? Because if they don't own it, if they don't take ownership of it, who will, right? Whose responsibility is it? So that's a really fundamentally important model of what we're seeing.
And because we don't know how to do that, there's launching $1 billion climate innovation fund, because we don't actually have the solutions for this yet. So that's interesting to know that they have. Some of the funding from that is going to be that they will have the tools to measure their own carbon footprint, and to say that you get an internal carbon tax, so that every department is going to pay for its own emissions. So that's what they're starting. And then by sometime within the next year, they want to move that out to their supply chains as well, so that their suppliers will also be taxed on their emissions, and that means they have to measure them to know.
So companies have to do things on their own, but they also have to work together, right? This is also, again, something related to Microsoft, where they recognize that we just can't keep going the way we do. And that basically we need to find a way that the reality is that we have 10 years to transform every sector of the global economy. So that, again, this is an important message, that recognition that every sector of the global economy has to be transformed. They created this thing called Transform to Net Zero. Mercedes-Benz is in it, Danone, Unilever, Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world, et cetera, right? So this is, again, like the moonshot, right? You can't do it alone. you have to come together with others. These are incredibly encouraging signs. Project Drawdown, which we mentioned earlier, they are creating something called Drawdown Labs, and Google is involved in them, and as are other companies. Again, a really good signal. Just on January 27th, 2 weeks ago, in Davos, they announced something called the Mission Possible Partnership, which is for companies that are the worst offenders in the climate space to join and figure out what are we going to do and make these kind of significant commitments together, right? So these are airlines, airplane manufacturers, transportation companies, all those kind of companies. 400 of them have signed on to
and
that
this
project.
is pretty much starting in the last year. So if you think about that yellow curve and what it's like to be a pioneer at the beginning of an era, is that this stuff is kicking in, so that there's people who are interested in being partners and interested in being investors or co-investors. So the things you're creating, there's
Huge.
suddenly a pull for it. There's a call for it.
Yeah.
So
hackers, there's money. And then there's a startup. Speaking of hackers, right? That's where hackers go often, is they create their own startups.
this one was free electrons. This came from 10 energy utilities that were brought together, where utilities are interested in looking at what can the startups bring them in the way of energy. And so they look at that, and then they partner with them and mentor them. We were doing some presentations just looking at only at Silicon Valley, and it turns out there's like 13 incubators only focused on energy, incubators and accelerators. They didn't even all fit on the page. A couple of examples that are coming out of there. Opus 12 is one, and they're taking carbon dioxide from the smokestacks and capturing it from the air and seeing what are the products that they can turn it into. Air Miners is actually quite interesting because
you should all check them out. They're extraordinary.
Airminers.org, and they're a platform for capturing anyone who's working in carbon capture, all the different methods for getting carbon out of the air, carbon sequestration, where do you put it? So can you reverse oil wells, right? How do we get it down into the ground? But also, there's a lot going on with oceans in terms of how do you get the CO2 to turn back into carbonate, and how do you get it into the deep waters of the ocean? So all kinds of things happening there. And then Novo Nutrients is saying, how do we turn it into products? That's the third area. Well, it's the third area of Air Miners, is like capture, sequestration, but also what kind of products can we put it into? Novo Nutrients is taking that CO2 from the smokestacks, using those fermenters that we saw very early on in that walk through time. Those fermenters are still here. They still take CO2 and ferment it and turn it into proteins. They're still doing that. We can still use them. And so turning it into proteins for the fish farms, and that way you don't have to fish out all the little fish in the ocean that are getting fished for the fish farms, and we can still end up with farmed salmon on the plate.
An interesting project and a leader in this space is Bill Gross, who has something called Idealab. It's in Southern California, and they're doing some amazing things, really interesting developments. Jen, check him out. We're not going to go into any depth other than to talk for a minute about Energy Vault. Greg was talking about, batteries and the toxicity of batteries. This is a super interesting battery, which is basically cement blocks that are being pulled up while there's overproduction in energy, and then they're pulled down. And it basically is similar to in Switzerland, where I'm originally from. We have a lot of pumped hydro. We pump up the water into lakes and then bring it back down at night to power our homes. But look at the pricing. This new Energy Vault technology brings the price down to levels that are tenfold below what a battery costs, and is not toxic at the level that we are doing with these other things. So I could easily imagine having an Energy Vault associated with an island or one of those floating cities. They could probably be made quite beautiful, and you just have these weights going up and down, and as energy is being produced and being used at the cost of 3.5 pennies instead of 25 cents, right? Stuff like that. Very, very interesting stuff. Direct air capture. Now we're talking about, you're familiar with these kind of things, but these are the engineered solutions. The problem there is you have to produce the energy to get there. Much more interesting, or very interesting by now, is Lansing's soil usage for carbon capture and sequestration. Please watch Kiss the Ground, this remarkable film. If you get at all mobilized by this film. We know the producers and creators of it, and we're happy to hook you up. It's really a special sort of perspective that makes it really clear on how important it is to get back to a kind of agriculture away from this industrial agriculture that basically made it impossible for the land to naturally absorb CO2. You know, there's there are lots of territories. This is just a picture. We're not going to go into any depth to clarify to your hackers. There's a lot of spaces to check, to go into. There are a lot of places to hack into that are going to make a massive difference for the benefit of our
And
climate.
so many of them involve that water, land kind of farming, and some are even just water farming in terms of seaweed farming. So thinking about the different uses of not just the engineering solutions, but the biological solutions.
Mycelium, another really interesting thing to start to think about hacking into. You know, how can we use, again, another natural thing that can draw down massive amounts of CO2? And you guys are talking about this. I think Greg has made a fantastic presentation of that, but ocean sinks are really a remarkable space to engage with and to hack into, as you well know. And, you know, people like Elon Musk are starting to wake up to this opportunity. And he just announced $100 million X Prize type thing for this exact thing, for carbon capture technology. There'll
be more details online by Earth Day, so look for it. But there's already some on it about it.
And, you know, it's actually for hackers. The 200,000 prizes are exactly for the people who are in this hacking competition. The $3 million prizes are for the companies or, you know, bigger enterprises. But they're going to be, I think, 20 winners at the level of you hackers who are there. And, you know, grab it if you can. Why not make it beautiful, Lisa?
Why not make it beautiful? Like, we've seen a lot of the engineering solution, but what's the role of artists and creatives in building this new world? We don't just want like the carbon capture machines around us, but, you know, what if solar is just beautiful? What if we capture wind energy? What about the energy around the water? And can even be quite playful,
Whimsical,
right? So you can see what are some of the water-based solutions that we can have, and just kind of capturing that spirit of the wind.
I think you're making a really important point. I think whenever civilizational shifts have happened, think of the Renaissance or whatever, that connection between the techie part of human brains and the artistic, social, connected part of human brains is really fundamental. And I think this is what we're going to have to see as here.
And I heard so many of the speakers before also talking about how tourism is still important to them, particularly if we get clean biofuels, so that we're not adding carbon to get there. But that's, you know, people are working on that one. So that looks like it's in the works. But so what else attracts people? Having something that makes them feel visionary about what we can create as humans also gets people there. But it is, as we heard, it's also educational. It inspires them about what they can do in their own area of the world when they go home. So I think having that as part of having these kinds of art and exhibits as something that helps spread this culture so that we can help shift into a new era even faster.
So this is what we wanted to leave you with, to kind of show you the magnitude of what we are engaged with and how thankful we are to you to basically welcome you to your home in a new way and realize together that this depends.
And the moment in which you're being a hacker, right? It could be that even 20 years ago, I don't know if we had hackathons 20 years ago, but we did have innovation programs, and just feeling like this moment's different. You're in this kind of event at a really unique and important and urgent time. It's not just play.
So hi, we're back.
Thank you so much. Again, so inspiring, the aha moments, so many of them. We did take a breath, especially since, you know, the ocean is something that we are talking about these 2 days all the time, constantly.